Dag the Bogus Fáilte. Hi, hello, and welcome. It's John O'Sullivan from the Irish Pagan School. And I got an email. I got an email from Tyson Chase, and they asked a question which I thought, yeah, it's one I've answered before, and it's one Laura has kind of answered as well. I thought, that's something we really should do a quick video about. So if it's okay with yourselves, I'll start by reading out the email. Um, so Tyson got in contact with us, and while I've been exploring paganism for roughly 20 years, it has felt highly appropriative. This has clearly been an area where you and Laura fight to bring awareness. In deconstructing much of what I've learned up to date, I've primarily focused on Welsh myths. However, I'd very much like to return to my ancestral roots. One area where I'm having trouble is locating a tale centered around reincarnation. While it's greatly unfair to compare, it is the best I can do in trying to express my search. In the Mabinogi, there is a tale of Ceridwen and Gwynbach. Though it appears to be a zoomorphic in nature, it represents cycles of reincarnation. Long email short, does Irish mythology or folklore offer a similar myth or story? If so, could you kindly point me in that direction? So thank you very much, Tyson, for reaching out and sending me the email there. It is something that we do talk about in regards to the Irish lore and the Irish kind of myth and folklore and spiritual practices. The word that we actually use, though, is transmigration of spirit, because the term itself, given your awareness of appropriation, reincarnation is actually a specific term that is linked with a lot of Asian religions, be it like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism. I'm not an expert in those areas. I try and steer clear into my own wheelhouse, but in the same way that like the word shaman is a term particularly associated with certain kind of religious spiritualities that develop in certain areas, we try and be very conscious of what wording that we actually use, which is why we actually try and use the transmigration of spirit instead of the word reincarnation, which means that it's easier to kind of separate when we're talking about our stuff and not anyone else's stuff. So answering your question, speaking about our stuff, the Welsh, I'm not up on the Welsh myths. I know some of them. I do come across the reference as a Dagda guy, a person who works for the Irish god on Dagda. There's a lot of confusion sometimes because the Dagda has one of the four treasures of the Tuatha Dé Danann, which is the cauldron of the Dagda, from which no company goes unsatisfied. But people kind of confuse that or cross it over or misconstrue some of the story around it, because there is also another cauldron in the Mabinogi, which is the story about Bran. And it does involve a connection between Ireland, because it's this relationship between them and a conflict, which involves a certain cauldron from which bodies would be put in, and then they could be taken out, restored to life, or brought back to life. So the same function applies in the Irish lore. We have healing wells done by Dinchecht and Armage, his daughter, and the other children of healing. I have a class on that at the Irish Pagan School if you want to know specifically about those deities. But when it comes to the transmigration of spirit, what we're talking about is not restoring someone to life. We're talking about the spirit transitioning or changing or moving through cycles of life. In the same way that Dagda has like his club, one end which would bring death, and the other end, the gentle end, which would restore life to dog which had died. That is not transmigration of spirit. That is just restoration of something which had passed. When we look specifically for transmigration of spirits, there are a number of examples. We find a lot of them in the Ulster cycle of the lore and the myth, and the ones really from the top end down, if you want to be, a lot of it is picking back on the mythological cycle. So probably the first really would be the wooing of a Taun. A Taun is a character that we find as the most beautiful kind of person in all of Ireland. And when Midr, the foster father of Angus Og, young Angus, the son of the Dagda, he takes up Bruna Boynia in Newgrange. Actually, hold on, John. Don't tell everyone the entire story, but get it to the point there. As part of his relationship of restitution for wounding that happened to his foster father, Midr, Angus goes and woos and brings a Taun to a relationship with Midr. But Midr has another wife, Fuvnuk, and Fuvnuk is very much empowered and very much a person of power, and she doesn't do well with a Taun, and the pair of them bounce off each other, and she transforms a Taun into a pool of water. But that pool of water is then worked upon by the sun, which then turns it into a paste or a small kind of worm. The worm then grows and becomes a bug the size of a man's head. And it's described as this beautiful kind of bug, which, was glistening and glimmering, and the hum of its wings and the noises that it made was so pleasing. That Midder was 100% spot on, knew it was a Taun. It was a Taun's energy, her spirit, transmigrated into this bug. And so Midder forgoes any other wives or any relationships because he has the peace and love of his company in a Taun, who is this bug. Fovnuk hears about this, comes along, and then casts a wind which kind of drives the bug away. And for 7 years, the Taun is kind of lost. She ends up kind of arriving at Engus's brew, and Engus realizes this is a Taun, takes her in, and he's looking after her and protecting her, knowing that he's going to try and restore her to Midder in time. Fovnuk finds about that again, arranges a meetup with Midder and Engus to bring them to where she is, but then surreptitiously slips around and casts the same wind, which pushes a Taun out. But a Taun is then lost again for another 7 years on this wind, until eventually she's at the end of her energy and she's completely lost. And it says that she falls into a vast goblet, a golden goblet, from which a woman is drinking in Ulster. And it is the wife of Allard, one of the chieftains in Ulster. She drinks this paste, this bug, down with her drink, which impregnates her, and then she gives birth to the most beautiful child in all of Ireland, and she names her a Taun. So a Taun is then born again, having transmigrated into a pool of water, then into a pest or a bug, having lived, like lifetimes as that. I actually think it says that by the time she's born again as a Taun in a human form, it's been over like 120 years or so of her kind of journeying around. So again, time in the lore is a little bit odd, but we see multiple different iterations of a Taun growing and moving through that. And eventually Midder does find out, actually Engus finds the new Taun and tells Midder about it. And then Midder kind of goes to pursue and the return of his love in this new form. So it's not the only story that we get. We also have later in the cycles, we have a warrior poet known as Mongan. And through the whole processes, like, there's actually a story in which it's inferred that Mongan is actually Fionn McCool. And so some of the warriors who kind of rocked around with Fionn actually recognize him reborn as Mongan, even though when kind of they touch on that or they try and mention it, he's like, no. He kind of shuts them down. So it's never actually said that he is 100% Fionn McCool reborn, but it is alluded to, because he knows how Fionn died. Whereas the only way to prove that would be to find someone who was there when Fionn died, because no one else actually knew that story properly. And so that's the kind of tipping of the hat to that it was Mongan. One of the most interesting ones, though, and it is one that forms one of the Ravescale or center pre-stories to the Taun in the Ulster cycle, is the quarrel of the two pig keepers. And this one is absolutely fascinating because not only does it talk about not just one, two people who go through a constant transmigration of spirit, but they also move through a multitude of different aspects or different forms down through the generations until they reach their final form, which is their final conflict. In brief, these two pig keepers are looking after the wealth of two rival kingships, Connacht and Munster. And because in those days, it wasn't about cattle, it was about your herds of pigs. So they get into it with each other. And like, pig keepers were not just farmers. They were like, you're not just a person looking after a herd, you're the person who's trusted to look after the wealth of your chieftain, so these two lads are very skilled individuals. They're pretty much magic users on a high-end level, and they're friends initially. And they have this agreement where, sure, like, your pigs might graze in my area, my pigs will graze in your area, and it'll be grand. We'll have everything will work itself out eventually. But then, yeah, they end up coming across a bit of a loggerheads issue when their rival chieftains get into it over territory, and suddenly their friendship is put to a strange position And one lad says to the other's like, oh, sure, it's well enough. I let your herd graze on my lands. No wonder they're so big. And the other lad's like, hold on. It's well enough for you that, I let yours graze on my land, which is why they're so big. And so these guys get into it. What's great about this is that as the story goes, they die and they're reborn. They're like shifting and changing their spirit time and time again through different lifetimes. But this story, more than any other one, is brilliant because it lists the number of times they do it, what they change into, and their names in those new forms. And so I've pulled it out from the story here, and I'll actually just read it out. It's from The Quarrel of the Two Pig Keepers. It's a section from the Ulster Cycle of the Irish lore. And Rucht and Fruch were their names when they were pig keepers. Ingen and Etch, Talon and Wing when they were two birds of prey. Bleed and Blood, Whale and Sea Beast when they were two undersea creatures. Rin and Fenber, Point and Edge when they were two warriors. Skach and Skiach, Shadow and Shield when they were two phantoms. And Crunic and Tunic when they were two maggots or paste. Then their final form, very famously, Fenvianach the White and Dunculnia the Brown were their names when they were two bulls. So centered to the story of the Táin, which is this main tract of the Irish lore around the Ulster cycle, is the conflict of these two bulls, the white bull and the brown bull. But it turns out that when we actually look at the rest of the lore, the stories involved, this is a clash of eons. This is a clash of intergenerational warfare that has been going on time and time and again as these spirits transmigrate into a new form each time, as birds of prey having to go at each other in the sky, as peist or dragons or worms, as warriors, they're born in physical form to go at each other again, as shades or phantoms, not even with physical form. They're still, their spirits are identified enough to have names upon them, because names are very, very important things to maintain their story and their identity. But eventually they come down to Fionvanach, the white bull, and the Dunculnia, the brown. And at the end of that kind of conflict, we know that the Dunculnia is the one. Wait, hold on. Fionvanach? Fionvanach is the one who falls. And he's torn all apart as the Dunculnia kind of runs away back home up to Ulster. So there is a lot of stories in the Irish lore and mythology and folklore about the transmigration of spirit. It is something that we see throughout the entire process, and it is not something that is specifically related only to physical manifestations of human beings. We can see it happen because with a Táin, it goes through an entire cycle and she eventually is reborn into a human form. With Rucht and Fruch, they take on human form partway through their war through the generations. And again, we have Fionn possibly inferred as being reborn as the warrior poet Mongan. So I hope that answers your question for you. Thank you very, very much for getting in contact with it, Tyson. It's really, really great and inspiring to be able to kind of answer these questions and to kind of, we know what we know, but sometimes unless we're put to the question, it's hard to kind of know what we should be answering for people. So I really, really love a good question. I say it time and time again, someone presenting me with a good question is presenting me with an opportunity to enjoy their perspective on things, but then also follow my own thought processes through and see if there's something that we can all learn from it. So as ever, Gurav Mila Mahagas, thank you very, very much for being with us, all of us here at the Irish Pagan School. And until next time, look after yourself, take care, agus slán. Goodbye.